The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the warm lights from the shops and cafes that lined the busy downtown area. People rushed past each other, caught up in their own worlds, checking phones, carrying shopping bags, laughing with friends. Nobody paid attention to the thin woman standing outside the large glass window of the cafe called The Grand Note. She had been standing there for almost 20 minutes now, just watching. Inside, people sat at small round tables covered with white tablecloths. They were eating sandwiches, sipping coffee, talking and smiling. The smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans drifted out every time someone opened the door. Her stomach twisted with hunger. It had been 2 days since she'd had a real meal. Yesterday, she'd found half a bagel in a park trash can. The day before, a kind woman at a shelter had given her a bowl of soup. But the shelter was full tonight and she had nowhere to go. Her coat, once a nice winter jacket, was now faded and torn at the sleeve. Her jeans had holes in them, not the fashionable kind, but the kind that came from wearing the same pair every single day for months. Her shoes were held together with duct tape, but none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the piano. Through the window in the far corner of the cafe sat a beautiful black grand piano. The lid was open, and even from outside she could see how the polished wood reflected the soft lighting. It looked like it was waiting for someone. Her fingers tingled just looking at it. She remembered how the keys felt under her touch, smooth and cool, how they would respond to even the gentlest pressure. It had been 3 years since she'd played a real piano, 3 years since everything fell apart, 3 years since she'd lost her husband in that terrible accident, since the medical bills had eaten through their savings, since she'd lost their apartment, since the world she knew had completely vanished. She'd gone from performing in beautiful concert halls to sleeping in her car. Then, when the car was repossessed, to sleeping in shelters or on the streets. But she still had her music. In her head, she could still hear every note, every chord, every piece she'd ever learned. Sometimes, late at night when she found a safe doorway to sleep in, she would close her eyes and imagine playing. Her fingers would move in the air, pressing invisible keys, and she could almost hear the sound. Today, though, looking at that real piano through the window, something stirred inside her, a spark of courage maybe, or maybe it was just desperation. She was so hungry that her hands were shaking. She needed to try. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the cafe door. A small bell chimed above her head. The warm air hit her face, and with it came the incredible smell of food. Her mouth watered immediately. The cafe was about half full. Business people in suits sat typing on laptops. A group of college kids huddled around a table. Textbooks spread out between their coffee cups. An older couple shared a piece of cake. Near the window, a mother was cutting up a sandwich for her small daughter. When she walked in, several people looked up. She saw their expressions change. A well-dressed man in a navy suit glanced at her torn jacket and quickly looked away. 2 young women at a table near the door whispered to each other, one of them pulling her expensive purse closer. A teenage boy wrinkled his nose and turned back to his phone. She was used to this. She knew how she looked. She knew how she smelled after days without a proper shower. She'd learned to make herself invisible to keep her head down. But today she couldn't do that. Today she needed to be brave. The counter was at the front where a man in his 40s stood wiping down the espresso machine. He wore a black apron with the cafe's name embroidered in gold thread. His hair was slicked back and he had the confident look of someone who owned the place. When he noticed her approaching, his friendly smile faded into something more guarded. She walked up to the counter, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were still shaking and she clasped them together to try to steady them. The manager looked at her, waiting, his eyebrows slightly raised. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, a bit rough from not talking much lately. "I was wondering if I could play your piano. Just one song, in exchange for something to eat, anything, even just a piece of bread." For a moment there was silence. Then someone laughed. It was the man in the navy suit. He tried to cover it with a cough, but she'd heard it clearly. One of the college kids giggled. Then another. The whispers started up again, louder this time. The manager's face shifted through several expressions, surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like pity mixed with annoyance. He glanced over at the piano, then back at her. "The piano?" he said, his voice carrying across the now quieter cafe. "Ma'am, that piano is worth more than $70,000. It's not a toy. It's not for..." It's a professional instrument. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. I understand that. I would be very careful with it. I just want to play one piece, one song. I promise I won't damage anything. More laughter. The college kids weren't even trying to hide it now. One of them muttered something about homeless people and crazy. A woman in yoga clothes shook her head and said to her friend, "This is exactly why I usually go to the cafe on 5th Street. The manager sighed. The kind of sigh that said he had better things to do. Look, I appreciate that you're in a tough spot, but I can't just let anyone play that piano. It needs to be tuned regularly, and it's very delicate. I'm sorry, but let her play." Everyone turned toward the voice. In the corner, at a table she hadn't noticed before, sat an elderly man. He must have been in his 70s, with white hair and a neat gray sweater. His face was kind, with deep wrinkles around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. There was something about the way he sat, the way he spoke, that commanded respect. The manager looked surprised. "Mr. Peterson, I don't think—" "What harm could it possibly do?" The old man interrupted gently. "Let her play one song. If she breaks something, which I very much doubt she will, I'll pay for the repairs myself." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at her again, then at the piano, then back at the old man. Finally, he threw up his hands. "Fine, one song. But if anything happens to that piano, anything at all," she didn't wait for him to finish. "Thank you," she said quietly, first to the manager, then turning toward the old man. "Thank you so much." As she walked toward the piano, she could feel every eye in the cafe on her. People were still whispering. Someone took out their phone, probably expecting some kind of disaster they could record and share. The college kids were grinning, waiting for the entertainment. None of it mattered. She reached the piano and stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Her reflection stared back from the polished black surface, a tired woman with tangled hair and hollow cheeks. But when she sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, something inside her shifted. She closed her eyes and the cafe faded away. The whispers disappeared. The hunger, the exhaustion, the shame of the past 3 years, all of it vanished. There was only the piano, her fingers and the music waiting to come alive. Her hands rested on the keys, not pressing down yet, just feeling the smooth surface. The ivory was cool against her fingertips. She could feel the slight texture, the way each key had been worn by countless touches before hers. This was a well-loved instrument, a well-used one. Behind her, someone coughed. Another person laughed quietly. She could hear chairs shifting, people settling in to watch what they clearly expected to be some kind of joke, a disaster, something to talk about later over dinner. "This should be good," one of the college students whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. More giggles followed. The manager stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, his face showing a mix of impatience and concern. He kept glancing at the piano like he was already calculating repair costs. The woman in yoga clothes had her phone out, recording. Several other people did the same. In the modern world, everything was content. Everything was a potential viral video. The elderly man who had spoken up for her sat quietly at his corner table, watching her with an expression that was different from everyone else's. He wasn't smirking or looking amused. He was simply waiting, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes calm and patient. She took a deep breath. Her stomach growled quietly, reminding her why she was here. For food, for survival. But as her fingers found their positions on the keys, she realized it wasn't just about that anymore. This was the first time in 3 years she'd sat at a real piano. The first time she'd had a chance to touch the thing she loved most in the world. Her eyes closed. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't in a cafe anymore. She was back in the concert hall where she'd performed her last show. The seats had been filled with hundreds of people, all dressed beautifully, all there to hear her play. The stage lights had been warm on her face. The orchestra had been behind her, their instruments ready. Her husband had been in the front row, his face glowing with pride. That felt like a lifetime ago. Like it had happened to someone else, but her fingers remembered. She pressed down on the first key and the note rang out pure and clear. Then another, and another. Within seconds, she'd begun playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces ever written. She'd arranged it herself years ago to be played solo, without the orchestra, pouring all the emotion of the full version into just the piano part. The first few notes were soft, almost questioning, like someone waking from a long sleep. Then the melody began to build. Her left hand created a deep, rolling foundation, while her right hand danced across the higher keys, weaving the main theme. Her body began to sway slightly, moving with the music the way it always had. The cafe went completely silent. The college student who had been giggling stopped mid-laugh, his mouth hanging open. The businessman in the navy suit slowly set down his coffee cup, his eyes locked on her hands. The woman with the phone kept recording, but her expression had changed from amused anticipation to shock. The manager's arms uncrossed and he took a step forward, as if drawn by the music. Her fingers flew across the keys now, playing passages that most pianists spent years trying to master. The notes poured out like water, like light, like something alive. Fast runs cascaded up and down the keyboard. Her hands crossed over each other, moving so quickly they almost blurred. But every single note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly where it needed to be. The music grew louder, more intense. This was the part where the full orchestra would normally come in, adding layers of strings and horns and drums. But she made the piano sound like a whole orchestra by itself. The bass notes thundered like timpani. The middle range sang like cellos. The high notes sparkled like violins. People had stopped pretending to do anything else. Laptops were forgotten. Phones were lowered, though some were still recording. Food sat untouched on plates. The small girl who had been eating a sandwich climbed onto her mother's lap to see better. Even the teenage boy had put down his phone and was watching with wide eyes. She poured everything into the music. All the pain of the last 3 years. The grief of losing her husband. The humiliation of losing their home. The fear of sleeping on cold streets. The hunger. The loneliness. The moments when she'd wondered if she could keep going. But also the small moments of beauty she'd found. A sunrise seen from a park bench. A stranger's unexpected kindness. The memory of her husband's laugh. All of it went into the notes. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't stop playing. Her fingers knew the way. They'd played this piece 100 times, 1,000 times, in concert halls and practice rooms and her own living room, back when she had a living room. The muscle memory was so deep it felt like breathing. The melody shifted into the second movement, slower now, achingly beautiful. This was the part that always made people cry. She remembered her husband telling her once that this section felt like remembering something you'd forgotten you'd lost. He'd been right. That's exactly what it was. The businessman's eyes were wet. He wiped at them quickly, looking embarrassed, but he couldn't look away. The college students had gone completely still, their earlier mockery forgotten. One of the girls had her hand over her mouth. The manager had actually sat down on a stool behind the counter, his expression stunned. The elderly man in the corner was smiling, but tears were streaming down his weathered face. He nodded slowly as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Then came the final movement. Her hands attacked the keys with renewed energy, playing the triumphant soaring melody that made up the conclusion. This was the part about survival, about continuing despite everything, about finding joy even in darkness. Her whole body moved with the music now, leaning into the dramatic chords, pulling back for the softer moments. The notes rang out through the cafe, filling every corner, bouncing off the walls, vibrating in people's chests. It was the kind of music you didn't just hear, you felt it in your bones. Several people had goosebumps on their arms. The mother holding her daughter was crying silently. The teenage boy's mouth was hanging open. She reached the final passage, her fingers dancing through the complex runs one last time. The melody built and built, climbing higher and higher until finally she played the last triumphant chord. Her hands came down with perfect precision and the note rang out clear and strong, then slowly faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The cafe was frozen, like someone had pressed pause on the world. Her hands were still on the keys, her eyes still closed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The last note hung in the air, fading, gone. Then someone started clapping. It was the elderly man. He stood up from his table, applauding slowly, deliberately. Then the businessman joined in, his clapping faster, more urgent. The mother shifted her daughter to one arm so she could clap too. The college students jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting. The manager was clapping. The woman in yoga clothes was clapping while still holding her phone, tears running down her face. Within seconds, the entire cafe was on its feet, The applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls. People were shouting things like incredible and amazing and oh my God. Some were still crying. The small girl was clapping her tiny hands together, not really understanding what had happened but knowing it was something special. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking in the bright lights. For a moment she was disoriented, confused by the applause. Then she remembered where she was. In a cafe, playing for food. She turned around on the bench, looking at all the standing clapping people, and her tears came harder. The elderly man was walking toward her, moving slowly but with purpose. When he reached the piano, he looked down at her with an expression of wonder and recognition. His voice shook slightly when he spoke. "I know who you are," he said quietly, though the cafe was still applauding. "You're Katerina Chen." The name hung in the air like a ghost from another life. Katerina Chen. She hadn't heard anyone speak that name in so long. For 3 years she'd just been "hey you" or "ma'am" or nothing at all. Most of the time, people on the street looked right through her like she didn't exist. The applause was starting to die down now, but people were still standing, still staring at her with expressions of shock and confusion. The elderly man stood closest to the piano, his eyes searching her face. "You don't remember me," he said gently, "but I saw you perform at the Kennedy Center 7 years ago. You played this exact piece with the National Symphony. I was conducting that night." Her breath caught. She looked at him more carefully now, and slowly, recognition came. The white hair had been darker then, more gray than white. He'd worn formal conducting attire, not a casual sweater. But the kind eyes were the same. The way he held himself was the same. "Maestro Laurent," she whispered. He smiled, and more tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "I thought you had died," he said softly. "We all did. You disappeared 3 years ago, and there were rumors. Some said you'd moved to Europe. Others thought you'd quit music entirely. But most people assumed. Well, they assumed the worst. The cafe was quiet enough now that everyone could hear their conversation. People were leaning in, trying to catch every word. The manager had come out from behind the counter and was standing nearby, his earlier irritation completely gone, replaced by something like awe. Katerina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her sleeve was dirty, and she felt suddenly embarrassed about how she looked. Here was someone from her old life seeing her like this. "I didn't die," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the person I was, maybe she did." One of the college students, a young man with glasses and a backpack covered in music store patches, spoke up. "Wait, Katerina Chen? The pianist? My professor talks about you in class. He says you were going to be one of the greatest of this generation. He plays your recordings all the time." Another voice, the businessman in the navy suit. "I saw you perform at Carnegie Hall. It was my anniversary. My wife and I still talk about that concert." He paused, his face flushing red with shame. "I laughed when you walked in. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should never have." "None of us should have," the woman in yoga clothes interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. She'd stopped recording and her phone hung limply in her hand. "I judged you the moment you walked through that door. I thought terrible things. And you're incredible." Katerina shook her head. "You didn't know. How could you know? I'm not who I was back then." "Your playing says otherwise," Maestro Laurent said firmly. He pulled out a chair from a nearby table and sat down, gesturing for her to stay at the piano bench. "Tell me what happened. If you want to. If you're comfortable." She looked around the cafe. Every single person was listening. The mother had set her daughter down and was standing with her hand on her heart. The teenage boy had moved closer, no longer trying to look bored or disinterested. Even the staff, a young barista and a cook who had emerged from the kitchen, were watching her. Part of her wanted to run, to leave this place and disappear back into the anonymity of the streets where nobody knew her name, where nobody expected anything from her. But another part of her, the part that had just poured her soul into that piano, was tired of hiding. "My husband died 3 years ago," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Car accident. He was driving home from picking up dinner. A drunk driver ran a red light." Several people gasped. The mother put her hand over her mouth. Maestro Laurent nodded slowly, his expression full of compassion. "He survived for 2 weeks in the hospital," Katerina continued. 2 weeks of surgeries and treatments and hoping for a miracle that never came. The medical bills were enormous. We had some savings, but not enough. I sold everything we had trying to keep up with the costs. Our home, my piano, his car, our furniture, everything. After he died, I had nothing left. No home, no money, barely any possessions. I was so deep in grief I couldn't function. I missed a performance, then another. My agent tried to be understanding, but there are 1,000 talented pianists waiting for opportunities. When you miss shows, you lose contracts. When you lose contracts, you lose income. It spiraled so fast. The cafe was completely silent except for her voice. Someone was crying quietly. She thought it might be one of the college students. I ended up on the streets about 6 months after he died. At first, I stayed in shelters, but they're always full. I'd sleep in my car sometimes, but eventually that got repossessed because I couldn't make payments. For the last year I've been wherever I can find a safe place to sleep. The manager, whose name tag read Richard, stepped forward. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Miss Chen, I'm so deeply sorry. The way I treated you when you walked in, His voice broke. "I saw your clothes and I made assumptions. I was rude and dismissive, and I should have treated you with basic human decency regardless of who you are. I'm ashamed of myself." "We all should be," the businessman said. He stood up and walked over to where Katerina sat. He pulled out his wallet and took out a business card, pressing it into her hand. "I'm on the board of the Performing Arts Foundation. We have emergency funds for artists in crisis. We help with housing, medical care, getting people back on their feet. Please take this. Call this number tomorrow. We'll help you." The woman in yoga clothes came forward too, tears streaming down her face. "I have a guest house. It's small, just a studio, but it's warm and clean, and you could stay there. For free, for as long as you need." One of the college students spoke up. "My mom runs a clothing store. I can get you some clothes. Whatever you need." Another student. "I work at the university. We have practice rooms with pianos. You could use them anytime you want." The offers came flooding in. The mother pressed cash into her hand. The cook brought out a full meal, soup, sandwich, salad, dessert, and set it on the table next to Maestro Laurent. The young barista poured her a coffee and added extra cream and sugar without asking. The teenage boy, looking embarrassed but determined, pulled a $20 bill from his pocket and left it on the piano. Katerina couldn't speak. She sat there, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of kindness from the same people who had laughed at her just minutes ago. Her hands were full of business cards and cash and pieces of paper with phone numbers scribbled on them. Maestro Laurent waited until the initial rush of offers had subsided, then leaned forward. "Katerina, I'm conducting a benefit concert next month. It's for the Children's Music Education Fund. We already have a wonderful program planned, but I would be honored, truly honored, if you would perform as a guest artist." She stared at him. "Maestro, I haven't performed professionally in 3 years. I have no agent, no publicity photos, no proper clothes. I'm not ready." He smiled gently. "You just played one of the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire from memory, with more emotion and technical precision than I've heard in years. You made every person in this cafe stop and listen. You moved us to tears. You're more than ready. But I have nowhere to practice. No piano of my own." The manager, Richard, spoke up quickly. "You can practice here, anytime we're open. Before we open, after we close, whenever you want. The piano is yours to use. And you'll have the university practice rooms," one of the students added. "And my guest house is quiet," the woman in yoga clothes said. "Perfect for rest and preparation." Katerina looked down at the business cards in her hands, at the money people had pressed into her palm, at the meal sitting on the table waiting for her. She looked at Maestro Laurent's kind, hopeful face. She looked around at all these strangers who had become, in the span of one piano piece, something like allies, maybe even friends. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Maestro Laurent reached over and patted her hand gently. "Say yes. Say you'll perform. Say you'll let us help you. Not because of who you were, but because of who you are. Because your gift deserves to be shared. Because the world needs more beauty, and you create beauty. The cafe erupted in agreement. People were nodding, encouraging her, waiting for her answer. The woman in yoga clothes had pulled out her phone again, but this time she was typing, not recording. "I'm texting my husband to get the guest house ready," she said. "You can move in tonight if you want." Katerina looked down at the piano keys, still feeling the ghost of the music in her fingertips. She thought about her husband, about what he would say if he could see this moment. He'd always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. He'd tell her to take the chance, to trust these people, to let herself be helped. She took a deep breath and looked up at Maestro Laurent. Her voice was stronger now, more certain. "Yes," she said. "I'll perform." The cafe exploded with applause for the second time. The next morning, Katerina woke up in a real bed for the first time in months. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. Her eyes opened to see white curtains filtering soft sunlight, a clean ceiling without water stains or cracks, and a warm blanket that actually covered her entire body. Then she remembered. The cafe, the piano, everything that had happened. The guest house was small, just one room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. But to her, it felt like a palace. The woman from the cafe, who had introduced herself as Patricia, had brought her here last night. There were fresh towels in the bathroom, food in the small refrigerator, and a note on the counter that said, "Stay as long as you need. You're safe here." Katerina had cried when she read it. Then she'd taken her first hot shower in weeks, standing under the water until it started to run cold. She'd washed her hair 3 times, scrubbing away months of dirt and shame. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than it used to be, with new lines around her eyes and mouth. But she was clean, and her eyes, for the first time in a long time, held something that looked like hope. Now, lying in bed, she picked up her phone from the nightstand. It was an old phone, barely functional, but it still worked for calls. She had 17 missed messages. Her heart raced as she started reading them. The first was from Maestro Laurent with details about the benefit concert, rehearsal schedule, contact information for the orchestra coordinator, a list of pieces to consider performing. He'd ended the message with, "Take your time choosing. Trust your instincts. We're here to support you." There were messages from the people at the cafe too. Patricia had sent her address and had written, "I left some clothes in the closet. They might not fit perfectly, but they're clean." The businessman, whose name was Robert, had sent information about the Performing Arts Foundation along with an appointment time for tomorrow. "We'll help with everything," he'd written. "Housing assistance, health insurance, rebuilding your career. You're not alone anymore." The college student who worked at the university had sent access codes for the practice rooms. "Available 6 a.m. to midnight every day. Room 7 has the best piano. It's a Steinway, just like the one at the cafe." Even Richard, the cafe manager, had sent a message. "Piano is waiting for you whenever you're ready. And please come by for meals, anytime, on the house. It's the least I can do." But the most surprising message was from someone she didn't recognize. It was a video clip, and when she pressed play, she realized it was her performance from yesterday. The woman in yoga clothes must have posted it somewhere. The video had been filmed from the middle of the cafe, and you could see her at the piano, completely lost in the music. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but you could hear every note clearly. What shocked her was the numbers at the bottom. The video had been viewed over 2 million times. 2 million. In less than 24 hours. She scrolled through some of the comments, her hands shaking. "I literally have chills. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I'm crying at my desk at work. My boss asked what's wrong and I just showed him this video. Now he's crying too. This is what happens when you judge people by their appearance. She's a master and they almost didn't let her play. Who is she? Someone said her name is Katerina Chen. I need to know more about her story." That moment when you realize the homeless woman is more talented than anyone you've ever met. There were thousands of comments, tens of thousands, people sharing their own stories of hardship and comeback, people admitting they'd judged others unfairly, people asking how they could help. Katerina set the phone down, overwhelmed. Yesterday morning she'd been invisible. Nobody saw her. Nobody knew her name. Nobody cared if she existed or not. Now millions of people had watched her play. The thought was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. She got out of bed and walked to the small closet. Inside, just as Patricia had promised, were clothes. Nice clothes. Jeans that looked new, soft sweaters, a warm jacket, even shoes that might actually fit. There was another note pinned to one of the sweaters. My daughter's size. She's away at college and would be honored to know these are helping you. After getting dressed in clean clothes that didn't smell or have holes, Katerina made herself a simple breakfast from the supplies Patricia had left. Real eggs, fresh bread, coffee that wasn't from a gas station or made from packets at a shelter. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, hardly believing this was her life now. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Miss Chen, this is Angela Park from the morning news program. I hope I'm not calling too early. Katerina's stomach tightened. The press. She'd dealt with them years ago, back when she was performing regularly. Some had been kind, but others had been invasive, always looking for drama or scandal. I saw your video from the cafe, Angela continued. It's remarkable, truly. I was wondering if you'd be willing to come on our show to talk about your story. We have a segment about inspiring comebacks, and I think our viewers would love to hear from you. I don't know, Katerina said carefully. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of attention. I understand completely. But think about it this way. Your story is already out there. The video has gone viral. People are talking about you whether you participate or not. This would be a chance to tell your story in your own words. To control the narrative, Katerina bit her lip. The woman had a point. Can I think about it? Of course. I'll text you my contact information. No pressure. Whatever you decide. After they hung up, 3 more news outlets called within an hour. Then a podcast host. Then someone from a documentary film company. Katerina stopped answering the phone and just let it ring. This was too much, too fast. Instead, she grabbed her jacket and walked to the cafe. It was mid-morning, not too crowded. Richard saw her immediately and his face lit up. Miss Chen, you came, please sit anywhere. What can I get you? Just coffee, thank you. And Richard, you can call me Katerina. He brought her coffee and a pastry she didn't ask for, refusing payment. The piano's all yours whenever you want it. She looked over at the grand piano in the corner. Her fingers itched to touch the keys again. But there were people in the cafe, having conversations, working on laptops. She didn't want to disturb them. Go ahead, Richard said, reading her hesitation. Trust me, nobody will complain. She walked over to the piano and sat down. As soon as her hands touched the keys, everything else faded away. She started with something simple, a Chopin nocturne, soft and gentle. The conversations in the cafe didn't stop, but they got quieter. People glanced over, smiled, then went back to their coffee and their work. This was different from yesterday's performance. Yesterday had been desperate, emotional. Everything poured out at once. This was peaceful, just her and the music, the way it used to be before fame and pressure and expectations, the way it was supposed to be. She played for an hour, moving from Chopin to Debussy to some jazz arrangements she'd learned years ago. A few people came in specifically because they heard the music from outside. They ordered drinks and sat quietly listening. Nobody took out their phones. Nobody filmed. They just listened. When she finished, there was gentle applause. Not the standing ovation from yesterday, but something warmer. Appreciation without spectacle. Richard brought her more coffee. You know, he said, if you wanted to, you could play here regularly. Not for tips or anything like that. Just because people would love it. And you'd always have access to the piano. Katerina smiled. It was the first real smile she'd felt on her face in years. I'd like that. That afternoon, she went to the university practice rooms. The student had been right. Room 7 had a beautiful Steinway. She spent 4 hours there, working through pieces she'd performed years ago, seeing what her fingers remembered, what needed work. Some pieces came back easily. Others felt rusty, foreign, but it didn't matter. For the first time in 3 years, she was doing what she was meant to do. Not performing for survival, not playing for food, just making music because music was who she was. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Maestro Laurent. The orchestra is excited to work with you. Rehearsals start next week. Also, I may have mentioned your situation to some colleagues. You're going to be getting some calls from concert halls, just so you're prepared." Katerina looked at the piano in front of her, at her hands resting on the keys. She thought about the guest house waiting for her. The food in the refrigerator. The clean clothes in the closet. The people who had gone from laughing at her to supporting her in the span of one song. Life could change so fast. It could fall apart in an instant. But apparently it could also come back together. Not the same as before. Maybe better. Different, but real. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play again. The concert hall was exactly as Katerina remembered it. The same red velvet seats rising in tiers. The same ornate ceiling with its crystal chandeliers. The same smell of wood polish and old paper from programs. She stood backstage wearing a borrowed black concert dress that Patricia had somehow procured, and tried to remember how to breathe. It had been 4 weeks since that day at the cafe. 4 weeks of practice, preparation, interviews she finally agreed to do, and slowly learning how to be a person again. The Performing Arts Foundation had helped her open a bank account. She had an agent now, the same one who'd dropped her 3 years ago, but who had called crying and apologizing after seeing the viral video. There were offers coming in from concert halls across the country, but tonight was different. Tonight was real. 2,000 people had paid money to sit in those seats, and half the proceeds were going to the Children's Music Education Fund. The other half, Maestro Laurent had insisted, was going to her. "You've earned it," he'd said firmly when she tried to refuse. Through the heavy curtain, she could hear the audience settling in. The murmur of conversation, the rustle of programs, the occasional laugh. Somewhere out there were the people from the cafe. Richard had closed early so his entire staff could come. Patricia and her husband had front row seats. The college students had brought their whole music class. Even the businessman Robert was there with his wife. 5 minutes, Miss Chen," a stagehand said quietly. Katerina nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Her hands were shaking, not from hunger this time, but from nerves. What if she messed up? What if her fingers froze? What if everyone realized she was just a fraud who'd gotten lucky that one day at a cafe? "Katerina," she turned. Maestro Laurent stood there in his formal conducting attire, looking distinguished and calm. He walked over and placed both hands on her shoulders. "You're terrified," he said simply. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. That means you care. That means it matters." He smiled gently. "Do you know what I saw that day at the cafe? I saw someone who had lost everything but still had her soul. Someone who played not for applause or recognition, but because the music demanded to be played. That's who you are. That's who's walking onto that stage tonight. What if I'm not good enough anymore? You practiced this piece every day for 4 weeks. I've heard you play it. You're more than good enough." He paused, then added more softly, "But you're not the same pianist you were 3 years ago. You're better. You've lived. You've suffered. You've survived. That's in your music now. That's what people will hear." The orchestra was warming up on stage, the sound of instruments tuning, creating that familiar, chaotic symphony. Soon they'd be ready. Soon she'd have to walk out there. Maestro Laurent squeezed her shoulders once more. "Your husband would be proud of you." The words hit her like a physical thing. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry tonight. "Thank you," she managed to say. 2 minutes, the stagehand called. Katerina took a deep breath, then another. She flexed her fingers, shook out her hands. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The hunger. The cold streets. The shelter beds. The day she'd stood outside that cafe window, desperate and alone. The feeling of those piano keys under her fingers for the first time in years. The sound of applause from strangers who became friends. The lights dimmed in the concert hall. The audience grew quiet. This was it. She walked onto the stage. The spotlight was bright, just like she remembered. The piano stood in the center, a gorgeous black Steinway, its lid raised like a wing. The orchestra sat behind it, musicians holding their instruments ready. And beyond the light, in the darkness, 2,000 people waited. The applause when she appeared was warm, welcoming. She saw Patricia stand up in the front row, clapping enthusiastically. Others followed. Soon the entire audience was on their feet, giving her a standing ovation before she'd played a single note. Katerina felt tears threatening again, but she smiled instead. She bowed, placed her hand over her heart in thanks, and waited for everyone to sit back down. The silence that followed was complete, expectant. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, positioned her feet on the pedals, let her hands hover over the keys, closed her eyes, and then she began to play. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 again, the same piece from the cafe, but this time with the full orchestra. The opening notes from the piano were soft, contemplative. Then the orchestra joined in, the strings adding their voice, then the horns, building the sound into something massive and beautiful. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence now. The nervousness had evaporated the moment she started playing. This was where she belonged. This was home. The piano responded to her slightest touch, and the orchestra moved with her like they were breathing together. She poured everything into the performance. Not just the pain and loss, but the hope too. The kindness of strangers. The second chances. The reminder that you could fall all the way down and still find a way to climb back up. Every note carried a piece of her story. The audience sat mesmerized. In the front row, Patricia was crying openly. Richard had his hands clasped together like he was praying. The college students were completely still, barely breathing. All around the hall, people were experiencing something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. The second movement came, the slow, achingly beautiful section. This was where Katerina let herself think about her husband, about his smile, his laugh, the way he used to sit in the audience at her concerts, always in the same seat if he could get it, always with the same proud expression. He was gone, but he was also here somehow in the music, in her fingers, in her heart. The final movement built to its triumphant conclusion. The orchestra swelled behind her, drums thundering, brass singing, strings soaring. Her hands flew across the keys, playing the complex passages with precision and passion. This was it, the ending, the resolution, the moment everything came together. The final chord rang out through the hall, orchestra and piano together in one last powerful statement. Then silence for 3 heartbeats. Nobody moved. The last note hung in the air, fading slowly. Katerina kept her hands on the keys, her eyes closed, her chest heaving. Then the applause started. Not polite concert hall applause, but something wild and uninhibited. People shot to their feet. The sound was deafening. Someone shouted, "Brava!" Others joined in. The applause went on, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the space. Katerina opened her eyes and stood, turning to face the audience. The spotlight made it hard to see individual faces, but she could feel their energy, their joy, their celebration not just of the music but of her journey, of survival, of comeback. Maestro Laurent was clapping too, gesturing for her to take another bow. The orchestra members were tapping their instruments in approval. In the front row, Patricia was standing on her chair, clapping over her head. The college students were whistling and cheering. Katerina bowed once, twice, 3 times. Each time she came back up, the applause somehow grew even louder. People were wiping tears from their faces. Strangers were hugging each other. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about something bigger, something human. Finally, after what felt like forever, the applause began to fade. People started sitting back down, though many were still wiping their eyes and shaking their heads in amazement. Katerina walked off stage, her legs shaking, her heart racing. Backstage, there was a crowd waiting. Orchestra members wanting to congratulate her. Maestro Laurent pulling her into a hug. Stage crew giving her thumbs up. Patricia appeared from somewhere and grabbed her hands. "That was incredible," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "I've never experienced anything like that in my life." More people crowded around. Robert was there, already talking about booking her for a series of concerts. The college students wanted autographs and photos. Richard was there with his entire cafe staff, all of them beaming. But in the middle of all the noise and celebration, Katerina felt a strange sense of calm. This was wonderful, overwhelming, more than she'd dreamed possible a month ago. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It wasn't the standing ovations or the viral videos or the contract offers. What mattered was that moment at the cafe when she'd been brave enough to ask. When she'd chosen to sit at that piano despite the mockery, despite the fear, despite everything. That was the moment that had changed everything. Not because of the audience's reaction, but because she'd remembered who she was. Later that night, back in Patricia's guest house, Katerina sat on the edge of the bed with her phone. She'd declined the after-party, needing some quiet time to process everything. There were hundreds of messages, but one caught her eye. It was from the woman who'd posted the original cafe video. "I hope you don't mind that I filmed and shared it," the message read. "I know it changed your life and maybe that wasn't my place. But I think the world needed to see what I saw that day. That every person has a story and we should never judge too quickly. Thank you for reminding us of that." Katerina typed back, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." She set the phone down and walked to the small window. Outside, the city lights sparkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping in doorways and under bridges. People were hungry and cold and invisible, just like she'd been. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd talk to Maestro Laurent about starting a program. Something to help street musicians, something to give others the same chance she'd been given. But tonight, she just stood at the window and let herself feel grateful for the music that had never left her, for the strangers who became friends, for the reminder that life could surprise you, could lift you up when you least expected it, could give you a second chance when you thought all chances were gone. She thought about that moment in the cafe, standing at the counter asking if she could play for food. How different would her life be if she hadn't been brave enough to walk through that door, if she'd let the hunger and shame keep her outside? Sometimes all it took was one moment of courage, one question, one chance, one song, and everything could change.